My name is Mary Jewett. I have worked at the Lakes Environmental Association for about 13 years. And a few years into that, I started working in our invasive species program, so primarily milfoil, but over time, my job has evolved as these things do. So the reason that I chose this aquarium picture, it was very deliberate. There have been studies done on some of the invasive aquatic species or plants that we have in the United States, and many of them were used in aquariums. So there have been links between plants used for aquariums and some of the invasives that we have here in the States. So can people mute, please? Somebody is unmuted. So that's why I chose this aquarium picture. The fish dies and people dump out the aquarium, and that could be one of the ways that these things spread. So the presentation, it's going to have a few parts. Why do we care about invasive species? The 11 most wanted, which I'll explain. What invasive aquatic plants we have here in Maine now, and some of the ones that look like them. And then what do you do if you find a suspicious plant? I'm going to dive right in. So why do we care? So this is in plants in particular. This whole thing is about plants. We've been talking a lot about invasive aquatic species. We have a summit next week on invasive aquatic species. So we have started to focus more on not just plants, but the invasive animals that we're looking out for as well. But this is about the plants because this is really focusing on what we already have in Maine, right? So why do we care? Invasive species outcompete native species for space and food. So in the plants case, they come up earlier in the spring, like some of them grow underneath the ice, and they have more aggressive reproductive strategies than our native plants. So they're just better adapted, grow and spread rapidly, interfere with boating, fishing, and swimming. They can affect water quality. I don't think I'm supposed to use an A on that one. And those of you that have been, members of LEA, you maybe have heard this. We talk about phosphorus a lot, and phosphorus causes algae growth that then can lead to oxygen dropping in the lake. So it's kind of a similar thing, right? So instead of an algae bloom, you have just a ton of aquatic plants. So they die and cause the same or similar problem to what an algae bloom would do, right? If you have a lot of these plants in the water. Eradication is seldom possible. So once these things are established, they're very difficult to get rid of. We do have a plant control program at LEA, and we're pretty effective. I think we do a really good job, but it's super expensive, that program. So it's good to just stop them before they get here. And then does lower property values. There have been studies, primarily Lake Arrowhead in Maine has gone through a really rapid drop in their property values in Waldoboro. They have 3 invasive plants in their lake, and it's been pretty drastic. It's like 20 to 30% drop in the last 15 years, I think. And then another thing about our invasive species, that doesn't have any predators. So nothing is eating them, which is one of the reasons why they're able to spread so rapidly, is there's no native predators or diseases or anything that keep them in check. So not all aquatic plants are bad. This is something that we run into. People are like, I just don't, they have like a plant that's growing really thickly in their yard, right? Or in front of their dock, and they automatically say this is invasive. But our native plants can go through seasons of like growing really, really thickly and then going down again. And the thing with the natives is they do have a cycle. They do kind of have a boom and bust situation. With the invasive, it's going to be every year and it's going to get worse and it's never going to abate. But it's food, it's habitat for our native species. So we can't go in there just ripping everything out, because that would cause more harm. And then if you pull out the native species, that gives more space for the invasives. So plants are good. Here's a beautiful example of a nice native aquatic plants. This is Island Pond in Harrison. So this is a beautiful pickerel weed in the water there. So Maine's 11 most unwanted, and if anybody's super good at counting quickly, there's actually 12 on this list. The middle one, hybrid variable leaf milfoil. So that's a hybrid between Eurasian milfoil and variable milfoil that is not seen really on the list, but it is there. So this is a list of the Department of Environmental Protection came up with this list when we first passed the Maine Milfoil law in 2001 or 5, and they made a list. These are the worst invasive plants that are close to Maine, that are a real threat to Maine because they're close by or they're very aggressive. So these are the ones that it's illegal to sell or buy or propagate or own or transport. Anything with these is illegal to have. So occasionally, like a pet store, it'll crop up that somebody's got one of these plants, right? So the Department of Environmental Protection goes in and takes it away, maybe gives a fine. So this is by far not all of the invasive aquatic plants that we have in this country, but these are the ones that we think are the biggest threat to Maine. So I'm going to go into which ones we have in Maine. So if there's a red background, that means it's invasive. So curly leaf pondweed is the only invasive pondweed that we have in Maine. And the vein pattern looks like a stained glass window, which is, it's pretty, but it is something to look out for. The outside of the leaf is serrated, so this is hard to see. So sometimes you need like a magnifying glass to see some of these features, but that kind of ruffled edge that outlines the whole leaf, that's very unique to the curly leaf pondweed. And then it's ruffled like lasagna. And this example on the white pipe, that was actually found last year or the year before in North Pond, which is up in the Belgrade Lakes region. And these produce turions or winter buds. So this is it's kind of like a little seed that just kind of drops off the plant late in the season. And that can dry out, that can be in low light conditions. A lot of these turions are resistant to herbicides. So it is important to get these plants before these reproductive structures develop. So found in Kennebec River, Legion Pond, and West Pond. So I do need to add North Pond to that list. So this is our map, and we actually just got some new brochures, which we have at the office if anybody wants one. This is the map of where these invasive aquatic plants are documented in Maine. So, and that's something I like to stress is the documentation of these things. That doesn't mean that there aren't other lakes in Maine that have invasive aquatic plants. It just means these are the ones we found and mapped. So here's the list. And then curly leaf pondweed is our yellow triangle. So that's in a few places there. So pondweed lookalikes. Once you kind of know the difference of some of these, they can get easier to tell apart. So we've got variable pondweed. It's got variable leaves. So it's got two types of leaves. One is a floating leaf, the other is under the water. White stem pondweed, so looks ruffled, right? But it doesn't have that stained glass pattern on the leaves, and it's clasping, and the leaves are much larger than the curly leaf pondweed. And then clasping leaf pondweeds, there's a bunch of different ones, but these are ones where the leaf you can see is wrapped around the stem. And that is not something you see on the curly leaf pondweed. Next. So this is the bad one. They're all bad, right? But I would say of all of the invasive aquatic plants we have in Maine, this is the most aggressive. This is the one that I worry about the most. And it's got all these names: European Naiad, and then brittle water nymph, and then some people call it brittle Naiad. But it is this little plant. It kind of looks like a little fireworks, right? A little tuft there. And the leaves are very small. The leaves are serrated. So that means they've got teeth on them. Spreads by seeds. So lots and lots of seeds. And the seeds, do I have a picture of the seed? I guess I don't. The seed is in this picture. So it's just like 5 to 6 millimeters long, and it looks a little bit like a hemlock needle. So if anybody's a forester here, it looks a little bit like a hemlock needle. So this is one of the things, we are looking for green stuff on the boat and trailer. Well, that's not the only thing we need to be worried about, right? Found in Northeast Pond, Lake Arrowhead. This is one of the ones Lake Arrowhead has. And Secaucus Lake is going to be added to that list this year, which is in Limerick. And this is just a mass of it from Lake Arrowhead. Here's our map again. So again, that's the blue star, and that's all really in southern Maine. There's not any north of us here. So Naiad Look-alikes, this is the kicker, right? Slender Naiad looks so similar. So Slender Naiad that's the look-alike. That's the one that I really need to look at closely in order to tell. And we do have a mechanism in the state for doing DNA testing. So if there's any question, we can actually send some of these plants out to get tested. For the most part, we can tell the difference just from looking at it, but sometimes you can't. The Slender Naiad does have a serrated leaf as well, but the brittle Naiad, it's the teeth are more obvious. You can see them without a microscope. And then slender pondweed is on here mostly because I just needed to fill space on this slide, honestly, because it doesn't look a lot like it. The leaves are very long and skinny. So slender pondweed is not one that we would that would get easily confused with Naiad. And then this is the side-by-side of the slender Naiad and the brittle Naiad, right? So you can see the shape is very, very similar. The invasive Naiad in this picture has a darker leaf, right? It's darker green, but you can't bank on the color, right? And I think, yeah, here we go. So you can see the slender Naiad has these little serrations, but the European Naiad is almost toothed, right? Those serrations are very obvious. And then I put, these are 2 leaves that I collected last year of these species. So again, with the European Naiad, you can really see, it's almost got thorns coming off of it, right? You can see them very clearly. So. Hydrilla, other than, I would say Naiad's the worst, and then Hydrilla is next on my list. Grows in really low light, very, very deep, resilient to all of these ingestion, ice drying, herbicides, thyme. So these also produce these turions like what the curly leaf pondweed has. And we have had this terrible experience in Maine. Pickerel Pond in Limerick, they did herbicide treatments for like 5+ years, and they would put herbicides in this pond every single year, and they're fingers crossed it's done. They haven't had instances of it in a few years, but it's constant vigilance at this point. You have to keep looking because those turions, they drop off, they get into the mud. So they have to constantly be aware of that. And the key with Hydrilla is the whorls. So if you have a stem, a whorl is like the leaves all kind of symmetrical around a stem, right? So with Hydrilla, it's whorls of 4 to 8 leaves. So usually the ones I've seen is 4 or 5 leaves in a whorl. And that's really important because our native waterweed, so this is a waterweed, has 3, always has 3. And I'm going to show you a look-alike on this. The Hydrilla also has, the leaves are more toothed than our native weeds here. Oop, back, where did I go? Okay, yeah, so Hydrilla is only found really in this one spot, these little ponds in Woolwich, and they're not public. There's no public launch. So at this point, Hydrilla, at least movement around, like within the state, it's low risk, right? Because there's not like a big public boat launch. So these are the lookalikes. The common waterweed, again, has 3 leaves around a stem, and this is really, really critical. And one of the interesting things about Hydrilla that I've seen is every once in a while you've got one with 3. But if you look at a whole stem of Hydrilla, the average is not going to be 3. It's going to be 4 or 5. So this is part of looking at these plants as well, is you can't just take a tiny little segment. You need to look at the whole plant, or more than just like one little bit. And then mare's tail is another, I think it's a waterweed, but it's so weird and different, and I don't see it very, very often. And the whorls are 11 leaves, and these very skinny little leaves that are very obviously not Hydrilla. So this is another native. We have this invasive lily pad in Maine. So this is something that surprises people. I have boaters all the time, or boat inspectors even, that say, well, I know what milfoil looks like, so it's fine. We do have a lot of different shaped aquatic plants in the state. So European frogsbit is an invasive lily pad, and it has these kind of heart-shaped leaves. They're very rounded. I call it, and nobody likes it when I call it this, especially people at the DEP, but I sometimes call it frog's butt, because the shape of the leaf looks a little bit rounded. And I don't know if I have another close-up of that, but so one of the keys with this is that it's free floating. So all of our native lily pads have a stem that goes down to the bottom. Sometimes you can't tell because they're all tangled up or whatever, but European frogsbit is a free-floating plant, and it was really, when it was first discovered in Maine, it was on Cobbossee Lake, and they had just discovered Eurasian milfoil in Cobbossee Lake. So they were doing a comprehensive survey of the lake, and they found this cove that was just chock-a-block full of this frogsbit, and it was because of the way the currents of the lake went. It was not near a dock, it wasn't near a boat launch, and they had all just kind of congregated. So they discovered this in Cobbossee, which now has 3 invasive plants. Bunch stems on Cobbossee Lake. Oh, there you go. Yeah, so you kind of see, you can see like the lobes there. So this is a picture from Cobbossee Lake in Maine, and it's only found in that one spot. They found like a plant in a little pond in Stonington or someplace like that, but it was just one plant and they took it out. So lookalikes, I mean, a lot of them, but there are some big differences. So spatterdock are these huge leaves. Those are the ones with the little yellow knob. And water shield is very common. but it's a perfect oval, right? It doesn't have the lobes there. We've got fragrant water lily, which that's probably the closest that we see. It's usually bigger than frogspit. It's a pretty big leaf, and it has what we call cat ears, so you can see where where that space is between the lobes of the leaves. It's pointy, right? It doesn't have that rounded, heart-shaped look to it. And then little floating heart is another native that we have. So that's probably the closest. But the vein pattern is very different. It's more kind of ornate than the frogspit. So you can see the frogspit is quite flat, quite matted, and not doesn't have that same pattern. And here's our native species. So before we get into milfoil, I want to talk about leaf type a little bit. So we've got 3 different leaf types here: fork divided, branch divided, and feather divided. And all the milfoils have feather divided leaves, and anything with a feather divided leaf is suspicious. And the different milfoils have different number of leaves around the stem. And then these are bracts, and both of the invasive milfoils that we have in Maine have these. So they actually have flowers that come up above the surface. So that's very, very rare in our native milfoils. So if you have a milfoil with a flower above the surface, that's bad. So that's something that we look for. It doesn't always have the flower. That's like a mature plant, end of the summer kind of thing, but it is something that we look for. Eurasian milfoil, this is invasive. It's on the red slide. 3 to 6 leaves in a whorl. And then the biggest thing on this that is very obvious, well, there's 2 things. The number of leaflets on a leaf, right? So you can see this, it's a feather, and it's got 12 to 24 pairs of leaflets on this leaf. So that's very, very Eurasian milfoil. And then the other thing is the internodal space, which is the space between the whorls. And this might be overwhelming information, but this will be available, and I'm happy to talk to people about it outside of this. But the space between the whorls is very large, making it look a little bit wimpy, honestly. Not like really thick, like, oh, this is an invasive plant because it's thick, but it's actually much more aggressive than the more widespread variable milfoil, which is what we have in our area. So they, on Cobbessy, they're actually doing herbicide treatments for Eurasian water milfoil because it's that aggressive. It's very difficult to remove by hand. And then variable milfoil, this is the one that we have in our area. This is the most widespread in Maine. 4 to 6 leaves per whorl, 7 to 12 leaflet pairs. So again, not quite as many leaflet pairs. They're very small. Space between the whorls is very thick, right? People talk about it as being like a bottle brush shape, right? Because you look into the water at it and it's just this column of green. The red stem is typical, but not always. The variable milfoil that we found in Long Lake down here in Bridgeton has really pale, like maybe I would consider it like pale pink stem. So again, variable leaf milfoil. It varies in appearance. So this is one of the ones that we do send. There's a gentleman at St. Joseph's College that does the genetic testing for milfoil in Maine. So he can test it and see what species it is. And just like a tiny little fragment, I think they've done experiments like maybe 2 inches cut up. You don't have to have the root or a flower or anything like that. Just a 2-inch little can become a new plant. So this is an example from Long Lake. So again, it's not terribly obvious. And then all of the yellow squares is where the variable leaf milfoil has been documented in Maine. So again, it's the most widespread in Maine. And we have our little number 5 at the top there. next to the compass rose, is Big Lake down east. It has a lot of milfoil in it. And so that's something they're grappling with in a different part of the state now. It's starting to spread. Oh, here he is, the man, the myth, the legend. So this is Peter Lowell, our the original executive director for LEA, and he kind of spearheaded a lot of the push to pass the milfoil law back in the early 2000s, and kind of got a jump start on this, basically putting us ahead of other states in this fight. And this is him in the Songo River. This is when in 2000 and maybe 6 or 7, when the milfoil was very, very thick, and we had kind of just started doing our plant control program in the river there. Milfoil lookalikes, bladderwort. So again, doesn't have those feathery leaves, right? So if you look closely, the leaves are forked, right? They're branched. So they're not this nice symmetrical thing. So bladderwort, and this one we get a lot in the office. People bring it in because it grows thick. Like you can have really big patches of this. So people are really concerned about it. Anyway, at the end, I'll tell you a sad story, but mostly these are going to be native, and those little pouches there. Bladderwort is a carnivorous plant, so it actually, a little zooplankton will swim by and tickle some hairs on this little pouch, and it sucks it in and eats it. Crowfoot is another one. Again, once you like kind of know the difference and you're looking at the leaves, you can say, oh yeah, definitely, right? So this has these branched leaves. So again, not that feathery. They do have flowers that come up above the surface of different colors, but again, the leaf shape is drastically different than any of the invasives that we have. This is the one I would say is closest. So like when I see this in the water, if I'm out kayaking or something, I always give it a second look, double take, because it has that bottle brush appearance. It's got the leaves kind of going around the whorl. This is a picture that I took, and I was like, no, that was in Keyser Lake. So I was really panicked on that. But I got a sample and it was fine. And this is what the leaf looks like, right? So if you cut a little bit, float it in water, and you look at it, it is technically 2 leaves coming off of the stem opposite each other, but it's hard to make out, right? So these are these forked leaves that are definitely very different once you kind of get a closer look at it. But from first appearance in the water, it can be a little nerve-wracking. And then the native milfoils, which is annoying, but not terribly widespread. But we do have native milfoil in some of our lakes. I know Middle Pond, Moose Pond has a native milfoil. So it's something that we are constantly looking at, and people bring us samples. And these are the ones that sometimes we have to send out for testing. So low water milfoil, we've got Farwell's water milfoil, and one of the differences is they're in whorls, but also scattered. So it's not necessarily a strict whorl. Sometimes you'll have leaves coming randomly off of other parts of the stem. But again, these have feather divided leaves, right? So they're feathery leaves. They look just like that milfoil leaf. So we always want to see samples of these. And most of these do not have the emergent flowers over the on top of the water, but again, you can't bank on that. Just the absence of something is not definitive. And here's the native is on the top, variable, invasive is on the bottom here, and you can see, and again, they're not always present. The leaves kind of come off in random places around the stem. the invasive, it's really strict whorls. You're not going to see that. And then these little tiny bumps are called fruiting bodies. And native milfoil has fruiting bodies like that in the where the leaves meet the stem. Invasive ones don't. But just because they're not there doesn't mean anything, right? They might have fallen off. They maybe haven't grown on yet. So if you see them, that is good. But if you don't see them, you can't take a sigh of relief yet. And then this is another feather divided leaf, a feathery leaf, parrot feather, which is kind of it's a really cool plant. But I was bummed to hear that we had it in Maine. It grows, the feathery leaves are actually above the surface. Under the surface, it does look like a milfoil. But the really defining characteristic of this is this cool, like almost tree-like thing that comes up above the surface. And so this poor dog is swimming in that. This is only found in one place in Maine, and it's number 16, I think. It's a private pond. So it's a decorative plant. Somebody got it for their little pond, and then it took over because it's invasive. And they're like, oh, we didn't know, whatever. So the DEP is working on mitigating that and getting that out, but there's no boat launch. So again, it's here, but it's not a real concern for us at this point because it is not accessible to the public. So now those are the ones, those ones that I just went over. Those are the ones that we have in Maine, documented in Maine. So I'm going to go over a little bit the ones that the other ones on that 11 most unwanted list that we do not have documented in Maine at this point. So one of them is Brazilian Elodea, and this looks very similar to Hydrilla. Again, it has the 4 leaves per whorl around the stem. So this is how we know if it's not native, is because of those 4 leaves around the stem. And this looks very much like our water weeds. So obviously native to South America, found really in all of our neighbors. So it's certainly something that we have, we're keeping an eye out for. It's not widespread in other states. It's found in other states, but it's not one of the ones that is really like makes the news down there. Fanwort, this is, I think it's kind of a cool looking plant. One of our boat inspectors, one of LEA's boat inspectors 2 summers ago actually found this on a boat coming in from Rhode Island, and where it is pretty widespread. And it's got fan handles, right? So unlike any of the other plants that we have talked about, where the leaves are attached right to the stem, these have little stems, or right to the, the big stem. These have what I call handles. So you could like take them off with your little fingers and wave them around. It's got these little handles coming off. So that's the key characteristic of that. We know it's on a milfoil because it's got these super branched leaves, but then those handles make it even, that's a more defining characteristic. And then this is just comparing it to that water marigold. So again, water marigold, also not invasive, but that's kind of the closest that we have that looks like that. But those handles are very, very clear. So, and that's found all over. Yellow floating heart. This is hard because we have little floating heart in Maine that is native. But this has a very ruffly leaf, and when the flower comes up, it's this kind of beautiful, delicate yellow flower with delicate leaves. And again, it is free floating. So it's not going to have that stem going all the way to the bottom, if you can see that part of it. So, Spatterdock has a yellow flower, but again, it's like a little knob, right? So it doesn't look a lot like it. Water chestnut, looks like absolutely nothing that you have ever seen. It is bizarre looking. So it's got these spade-shaped leaves in this kind of in this clump at the top of its stem, and it has these crazy hard, like puncture your shoe nut that grows. That's its reproductive part. And these stick, we found them actually in Western Maine, at southwestern Maine. Somebody found one stuck to the carpet of somebody's trailer, like the bunk on the trailer. So it's pretty close. Again, it's free floating. I've seen citizen science initiatives down in some of these other states, people in canoes. You can just like go and just scoop it up and scoop it up and scoop it up, because there's no stem. I mean, there's no root, right? It's just free floating. So it looks kind of fun and satisfying. And you don't have to be a diver or something to do it. But not that I want it to come here, but if it did, we could scoop it out. So that's water chestnut. Dangerous. There's no look-alike, so I'm not even going to try because nothing looks like it. And then here's an orange slide just to be super confusing. Swollen bladderwort. So this is a bladderwort that we have found in Lake Arrowhead just in the last couple of years, and it is not native to Maine. It is considered invasive in other places. So this is it. I got a sample for the tank at LEA, which has now died. So we do not have that anymore. But the actual plant part, the leaf part under the surface, looks a lot like our native bladderworts. The flower is unique to this plant, and it does flower quite a bit later in the season. And it's got these big, do I have a picture of it? Yeah. So it's got these big floating bladder-like stems that come up, support the flower. So they're kind of these air-filled leaves, which are pretty unique. So again, this is in Lake Arrowhead. We haven't found it in other places. It is something that we're aware of, and the DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, is considering putting it on the list. So then it would not be 11 most unwanted, it would be 12. So I'm seeing that somebody's chatting, but I am going to continue and maybe answer questions at the end if we have time. So, so native to Southeast United States. So this is not something that came over from Europe or anything. And there are studies being done. Climate change, as our lakes warm, theoretically, they will be able to support invasive species that historically would not have survived here, right? But if the water is getting warmer, the growing season gets longer, it could lead to a more habitat for these invasive plants. So what to do if you are suspicious, which is a funny title. Get help if you're suspicious, but no, if you find a suspicious plant, right? So if you find a plant in the water, so you're out kayaking or you're sitting on your dock or whatever, take note of where you are, take a sample, put it in a bag, and or I'm going to say a photo of the plant. And we have now added a little page to our website where people can submit photos of plants that they find. And we want the photos to be, something that we can actually look at and determine what something is, because over the last couple of years, I love that people are looking out and like seeing things, but it's gotten to a point where we're just getting tons and tons of plants at the office, and some of which we could just identify from a picture. So we'll be sending out this link later as we get closer to the season, so people can do those submissions online. And then we would ask people to keep the sample, so that if we can't tell from the picture, then we would want somebody to bring it in. But if we can determine it from a picture, we would rather not just have tons of bags of plants in our fridge downstairs in the office. And then if you find one on your boat, very similar. I did bring a sample to 230 Main Street, but I think I'm gonna take that out because I think everybody can just follow this same protocol. Keep it in a bag with water and keep it in a fridge. And then you can submit a photo. And then if we need it, you would bring it to our Main Street office to get identified. And again, I love that there's so many eyes on the water, that people are really, really concerned. And as much as it occasionally will take a lot of staff time, I'd rather have people show us these plants, send pictures, than have something go undiscovered, right? So I constantly am saying that map of the infested water bodies in Maine, those are documented infested waters, right? So those are lakes where we have found invasive plants. That doesn't mean that there aren't more. And so it could be, we've had just citizens, just homeowners on Long Lake have found milfoil in front of their docks, and we go and we take care of it. So there is a lot of value in having our citizens in our communities keeping an eye out